Trains. There's something hauntingly beautiful about them, don't you think? The rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the dimly lit carriages, and the long stretches of track cutting through dark, empty landscapes. But sometimes what lies beyond the tracks, or even inside the train itself, isn't so ordinary. Tonight, I'm here to share with you three terrifying true stories from the tracks. Buckle up, because these tales might make you think twice before your next train journey. I'll never forget the night it happened. It was late November, and I was on the overnight train heading home for the holidays. The train was nearly empty, just a few scattered passengers dozing off or staring out the windows. I'd managed to find an empty compartment, something that felt like a small luxury at the time. I settled in with my book, the dim light above casting long shadows in the confined space. As the train sped through the countryside, I noticed something strange. A man passed by my compartment, moving slowly down the aisle. He had on an old-fashioned coat and a hat that seemed out of place, like he'd walked straight out of a black and white photograph. I thought maybe he was just eccentric, but there was something about him that felt wrong. He stopped and glanced into my compartment. Our eyes met, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they seemed hollow, like two dark voids staring right through me. I tried to ignore him, thinking I was just imagining things, but then he opened the door and stepped inside. "Do you mind if I sit here?" he asked in a voice that sounded distant, almost echoing. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He sat across from me, folding his hands in his lap. For a while he just stared out the window, but then he started talking. He spoke about things that didn't make sense, like how he'd been on this train for years, searching for someone. When I asked him what he meant, he simply smiled and said, "You'll see." The train began to slow, and as we approached a small, deserted station, the man stood up. He looked at me one last time and said, "Be careful, the tracks remember." Then he stepped out of the compartment and disappeared into the night. I thought he'd gotten off the train, but when I asked the conductor about him, he gave me a puzzled look. "There's no one like that on this train," he said. "To this day, I don't know who or what that man was, but every time I hear a train whistle, I can't help but feel like he's still out there watching." I've replayed that night countless times in my mind. What did he mean by the tracks remember? Was he a ghost, a warning, or something else entirely? Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I've heard his voice whispering those same words. And every so often, when I'm near a train station, I'll catch a glimpse of a man in an old coat and hat, just standing there watching. Maybe it's my imagination, but maybe it's not. Weeks after that night, I started noticing strange things happening around me. My reflection in the train window didn't always move the way it should have, and once I swore I saw the shadow of another person sitting beside me when I was completely alone. I started researching the train route, hoping to make sense of what I'd experienced. That's when I came across an article about a man who had disappeared on the same train line decades ago. Witnesses described him as wearing an old-fashioned coat and hat, just like the man I'd seen. The article said he'd boarded the train but never got off. Some say he's still searching for the family he left behind. Others believe he's trapped, reliving the journey over and over. It was supposed to be a simple commute. I was traveling through a remote mountain region, the kind of place where the train winds through long, dark tunnels carved into the rock. The journey had always been uneventful until that day. We entered one of the longer tunnels and everything went pitch black. Normally, the overhead lights would stay on, but this time they flickered and went out. People around me murmured, and I felt a growing unease. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was a low, guttural whisper, like someone speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right next to me. I turned to the seat beside me, expecting to see another passenger, but there was no one there. Just the empty seat and the faint impression of something unseen. Panic set in. I wasn't the only one who felt it. People were shifting uncomfortably, whispering to each other. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the lights came back on. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. In the seat across the aisle, a man was staring straight ahead, his face pale as a sheet. When I asked him if he was okay, he turned to me and said, "Did you see them?" I didn't know what to say, but he continued. They come in the dark. They've been following this train for years. Later, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just an electrical glitch, a trick of the mind brought on by the darkness. But then I spoke to another passenger, an older woman who'd been sitting a few rows ahead. She told me that she'd seen something too, shadowy figures moving through the train, their forms barely visible but undeniably there. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started asking around about the tunnel. A retired railway worker told me about an accident that had happened there decades ago. A train had stalled in the middle of the tunnel, and while they waited for assistance, the engine exploded, engulfing the carriages in flames. Dozens of passengers were trapped and perished in the inferno. The worker said he'd heard stories of shadowy figures in the tunnel, of whispers in the dark, and of the feeling of being watched. A few months after my encounter, I read an article about a similar incident in the same tunnel. A group of hikers claimed to have seen lights and heard voices, but when they reached the spot, there was nothing there. Some believe the tunnel is a portal, a place where the living and the dead collide. Others think the spirits of the victims are trapped, reliving their final moments over and over again. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain. I'll never ride through that tunnel without a flashlight again. This story was told to me by a close friend who swears it's true. He'd been hiking in a remote forest when he stumbled across an old abandoned railway track. Curious, he decided to follow it, not realizing how far he'd gone until the sun began to set. That's when he heard it, the distant sound of a train whistle. He froze, confused. The tracks were overgrown, rusted, clearly unused for decades. But the sound grew louder, and soon he could see a faint light approaching. Against his better judgment, he hid behind some bushes and watched as an old steam train came into view, its carriages glowing faintly in the twilight. The train slowed as it neared him, and he could see shadowy figures inside, their faces indistinct but unmistakably human. One of them turned to look out the window, and for a moment their eyes met. My friend swears that face looked exactly like his own. The train didn't stop. It passed by and vanished into the trees, leaving no trace behind. When my friend tried to tell others about it, they laughed it off, saying he must have been tired or hallucinating. But he knows what he saw. And now, every time he hears a train whistle, he wonders if the ghost train is out there, still searching for its next passenger. A few weeks later, he decided to revisit the area, hoping to find some clue about what he'd seen. What he found instead was a memorial plaque hidden among the trees. It commemorated the victims of a train crash that had occurred over a century ago. According to local legend, the ghost train appears to those who are lost, offering them a ride, but at a price. My friend hasn't been back since. And there you have it, 3 chilling tales from the rails. The next time you ride a train, take a moment to look around. That passenger sitting quietly in the corner, the flickering lights in the tunnel, the faint sound of a distant whistle. Could there be more to them than meets the eye? Trains have carried countless stories over the years, some of them too dark to forget. Until next time, stay safe and stay vigilant. You never know what might be waiting just beyond the tracks.